The atmosphere was tense in Paris. European leaders gathered for an emergency summit. The topic was the Ukraine crisis. The date was February 17, 2025. This was no ordinary meeting. Something had changed. The United States, Europe's long-standing ally, had taken a different path. The US announced bilateral talks with Russia. The goal was to end the war in Ukraine. But Europe was excluded from these talks. So was Ukraine itself. This decision sent shockwaves across the continent. European leaders felt sidelined. They worried about the implications for their security. This summit was a direct response to the US move. European leaders wanted to present a united front. They sought to reassert their role in resolving the crisis. The stakes were high. The future of European security hung in the balance. The summit was shrouded in uncertainty. Would Europe manage to bridge its internal divisions? Could it influence the course of events in Ukraine? One thing was clear: the continent was at a crossroads. The US decision to engage in direct talks with Russia sent shockwaves through Europe. The talks, scheduled to take place in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, would exclude both European and Ukrainian representatives. This move was seen by many as a betrayal of trust. US Secretary of State Marco Rubio was scheduled to meet with his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov. The stated aim of the talks was to find a negotiated settlement to the ongoing war in Ukraine. However, many European leaders viewed this as a thinly veiled attempt by the US to pressure Ukraine into making concessions. European media outlets were rife with speculation about the true motives behind the US decision. Some analysts suggested that the US was seeking a quick and easy solution to the conflict, even if it meant sacrificing Ukrainian interests. Others argued that the US was more concerned with containing China's growing influence than with defending European security. The US decision to negotiate directly with Russia without European involvement marked a significant shift in transatlantic relations. It raised serious questions about the future of NATO and the US commitment to European security. European leaders were left wondering if they could still rely on their American ally. The emergency summit in Paris was convened with a sense of urgency and purpose. European leaders, facing a rapidly evolving geopolitical landscape, were determined to present a united front. But achieving unity proved to be a complex and challenging task. Discussions at the summit centered around potential security guarantees for Ukraine. The possibility of deploying European troops as peacekeepers was also on the table. However, there were significant differences of opinion among the participating countries. Some leaders, such as UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, expressed a willingness to commit troops to Ukraine in the event of a peace agreement. Others, including Germany and Poland, remained hesitant, citing concerns about logistical challenges and the risk of escalating the conflict. Despite these differences, there was a shared recognition that a fragmented European response would only embolden Russia. The summit, therefore, served as a platform for intense negotiations and diplomatic maneuvering. The goal was to find common ground and forge a cohesive strategy. The question of deploying European troops to Ukraine loomed large over the Paris summit. The idea was controversial. It sparked heated debate among the participating leaders. Some saw it as a necessary step to guarantee Ukraine's security in a post-war scenario. Others viewed it as a dangerous escalation that could draw Europe further into the conflict. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer emerged as a vocal proponent of troop deployment. He argued that a robust international peacekeeping force led by Europe would be essential to deter future Russian aggression. Sweden's foreign minister echoed this sentiment, expressing a willingness to contribute Swedish peacekeepers. However, Germany and Poland voiced reservations about committing troops at this stage. They argued that the logistical challenges of deploying and sustaining a peacekeeping force in Ukraine should not be underestimated. They also stressed the importance of securing a comprehensive peace agreement before considering such a move. The debate over troop deployment highlighted the complexities of the Ukraine crisis. It underscored the difficult choices facing European leaders as they sought to balance their commitment to Ukraine's security with the need to avoid a wider conflict with Russia. While European leaders grappled with the question of how to respond to the US-Russia talks, Ukraine found itself in a precarious position. Excluded from the negotiating table, Kiev was left to watch from the sidelines as its fate was being decided by others. President Zelensky, in a defiant statement, announced that Ukraine would not participate in the talks in Saudi Arabia. He condemned the U.S. decision to engage with Russia without Ukraine's direct involvement. He asserted Ukraine's right to determine its own future. However, behind the scenes, Ukrainian officials were reportedly engaged in their own back-channel negotiations with the U.S. Rumors circulated that Zelensky was considering a controversial deal. This deal would grant U.S. companies access to Ukraine's vast reserves of rare earth minerals in exchange for security guarantees. The situation presented Ukraine with a series of agonizing choices. Should it stand firm in its opposition to any concessions to Russia, even if it meant risking further isolation? Or should it accept a deal that, while potentially offering some security guarantees, could compromise its sovereignty and long-term interests? Section 6. Trump's America, a shifting landscape for European security. The U.S. decision to pursue bilateral talks with Russia, excluding Europe, was widely seen as a reflection of the Trump administration's America First foreign policy. This policy prioritized U.S. interests above all else. It signaled a potential retrenchment from the transatlantic alliance. President Trump's recent actions and statements had already caused alarm bells to ring in European capitals. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had suggested that Ukraine might have to cede territory and abandon its NATO ambitions as part of a peace deal. These remarks were met with outrage in Ukraine and unease in Europe. Furthermore, President Trump had engaged in a lengthy phone call with President Putin just days before the announcement of the U.S.-Russia talks. This call, which was not disclosed to European allies beforehand, further fueled suspicions that the U.S. was striking a separate deal with Russia at Europe's expense. The Trump administration's actions raised fundamental questions about the future of the transatlantic relationship. European leaders were left wondering if the U.S. could still be relied upon as a reliable partner. They began to contemplate a future in which Europe would have to take on a greater responsibility for its own security. Section 7. A call to arms, European defense spending in the spotlight. The Ukraine crisis and the evolving U.S. foreign policy under President Trump had thrown into sharp relief Europe's long-standing reliance on American military might. The U.S., for decades, had been the guarantor of European security. However, recent events had cast doubt on the sustainability of this arrangement. President Trump had repeatedly criticized European nations for not spending enough on defense. He had demanded that they increase their military budgets to meet the perceived threat from Russia. The U.S., he argued, could no longer be expected to shoulder the burden of European defense alone. The Trump administration's pressure, coupled with the unfolding crisis in Ukraine, had prompted a renewed debate within Europe about defense spending. Some European leaders argued that it was time for the continent to invest more in its own security. They called for greater military cooperation and integration among European nations. Others, however, remained wary of alienating the U.S. They argued that a sudden increase in European defense spending could be perceived as provocative by Russia. They also pointed out that European countries face significant economic challenges, and that diverting resources to defense could come at the expense of other priorities. Section 8. Cracks in the facade? Internal divisions test European unity. While the crisis in Ukraine had initially galvanized European unity, the U.S. decision to engage in direct talks with Russia exposed underlying divisions within the continent. Different countries had different perspectives on how to approach the crisis. These differences threatened to undermine Europe's ability to present a united front. Hungary, a longtime critic of the EU and a staunch supporter of President Trump, openly criticized the emergency summit in Paris. Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban dismissed the summit as a useless talking shop. He argued that Europe should focus on engaging with Russia rather than isolating it. Furthermore, some EU member states expressed dissatisfaction that the summit had not been convened as a full EU meeting. They argued that the exclusion of certain countries undermined the bloc's unity and weakened its negotiating position. These internal divisions within Europe played into the hands of Russia. Moscow had long sought to exploit differences among European countries to advance its own interests. The U.S. decision to go it alone on Ukraine had inadvertently provided Russia with an opportunity to further divide and weaken the European Union. Section 9. The Road Ahead, Charting a Course for Peace in Ukraine. As the emergency summit in Paris drew to a close, the future of Ukraine remained uncertain. The U.S. decision to engage in direct talks with Russia had upended the geopolitical chessboard. It left Europe grappling with the implications for its own security and its relationship with its transatlantic ally. The summit had served as a platform for European leaders to express their concerns, coordinate their positions, and explore potential avenues for action. However, it had also exposed the deep divisions that existed within Europe. These divisions threatened to undermine the continent's ability to speak with one voice on the world stage. The road ahead promised to be fraught with challenges. The outcome of the US-Russia talks remained unpredictable. The possibility of a negotiated settlement that would satisfy all parties seemed remote. The risk of further escalation and violence loomed large. In this uncertain landscape, one thing was clear: Europe could no longer afford to be a passive bystander. It had to define its own interests, articulate its own vision for the future of Ukraine, and be prepared to act decisively to defend those interests. The stakes were too high, and the consequences of inaction too grave, for Europe to remain on the sidelines.